Okie dokie, folks. Today I'm trying out something new. You can see me. Hi. I think I'm in the corner of your screen. Today we're going to talk about the Boston Massacre. So what I want you to do is go ahead and take out a piece of paper and put your name. Today's date should be February 17th. The title, of course, is the Boston Massacre, and this is continuing the events that lead to independence. And then from there, this is based on ushistory.org, and it is presented to you by Mrs. Pines. So let's get that title on our papers. Okay, before we go to the actual Boston Massacre, I thought that a timeline in regard to the events that lead to independence might help you. And of course, this timeline does come from the ushistory.org website on the chapter that is the events that lead to independence. So what we're looking at actually are the British prime ministers, which are the equivalent of our president, and their roles in the events that led to independence. So from 1762 to 1763, we have John Stuart, also known as the Earl of Brute, yes, and he was involved in the end of the 7 Years' Wars, the 70 Years' War, and the Treaty of Paris that gave all of that land to us on one side, but then gave them all the land on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains, and the concept that we couldn't touch any of that land. Then from 1763 to 1765, we have George Grenville, who is the prime minister. He was the one who signed off on the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and the Currency Act. The Currency Act was the act that said that all of the money needed to be handled, if you remember, by the British coinage, not by the colonies setting up their own currency. 1765 to 66, these guys moved pretty quickly, is Charles Watson Wentworth, the Marquess of Rockingham. He repealed the Stamp Act and issued the Declaratory Act, which we all know didn't help much because you take away one, but then you brought back the other. You brought back the whole concept that we run everything with that Declaratory Act. We declare we're in charge. 1766 to 68 is William Pitt the Elder, and he is the Earl of Chatham. He issues the Townshend Acts on behalf of Charles Townshend, who was, remember, the treasurer, the chancellor of the Exchequer. Then we have 1768 to 1770 with Augustus Fitzroy, the Duke of Grafton, who is unable to implement the policy of conciliation toward the colonies because of chaos in Parliament. So Parliament is so chaotic and split over what to do about the colonies and other problems that they've got in England that they end up not really being able to do anything to deal with the problems in the colonies. Okay, 1770 to 1782, 12 years under Lord North. Under Lord North, we have the Boston Massacre, the repeal of the Townshend taxes or duties. Duties and taxes are the same word. We have the issuance of the Tea Act and the Intolerable Acts. Those are coming after the Boston Massacre. We have the American Revolution begin with the battles of Lexington and Concord under Lord North. Under Charles Watson Wentworth, Marquess of Rockingham, he comes back. See, he was 1765, now he's back in 1782. We have open peace negotiations with America. 1782 to 83, we have William Fitzmaurice, Earl of Shelburne, and he is the one who is in charge when the American Revolution ends, and he is the one who oversees the Treaty of Paris, 1763. Oh my goodness, 1783, because I was going to point out to you that 20 years apart, we have two different treaties of Paris. The Treaty of Paris, 1763, ends the 7-Year War. The Treaty of Paris, 1783, ends the American Revolution. So from the end of the 7-Year War to the United States becoming the United States is 20 years. Moving on, let's talk more about what are the events that lead to the revolution, that lead to the revolution. And of course, shedding American blood in America is going to be a big problem. We know that the road to independence began with ideas in the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening, but those were discussions. They were philosophical things. They were ideas. They didn't involve violence. But when blood is drawn, things are going to really change. And such is the case with the Boston Massacre in 1770, 5 years before that fateful day in Lexington. So the Boston Massacre actually happens 5 years ahead of the declaration of war in the Revolution. So what caused the Boston Massacre? Well, you pretty much already know. It's the Townshend Acts, and particularly the Townshend Act's effect on Boston itself. Lord Hillsborough, who is the Parliament's Minister on American Affairs, so he's kind of like the ambassador on American affairs, ordered martial law. Remember that martial law is the military takeover policing of an area, and he sent 4 British regiments, that means large groups of military, to occupy Boston because Boston was unhappy with the Townshend Acts. And in fact, in Boston, the British government officials feared for their lives, which is why Hillsborough sends over the 4 troops, the 4 sets of troops, or the 4 sets of regiments, in order to control Boston. The Bostonians, we remember, threatened a riot when 2 of John Hancock's ships were almost seized by the British Navy. Remember, they're big John Hancock supporters because he is a smuggler, and he is very, very much well-liked because he basically is a rebel. So things were tense, and so how do we make them better? We send the military in. Well, yeah, not so much. All right, so Hillsborough orders martial law, and things go from bad to worse. And of course, by sending in the troops, the British make the Americans skittish. They're very nervous, they're very upset. So we have 2 leaders, Sam Adams and James Otis, who called the assembly together, and 3 weeks before the troops are supposed to get there, and they talk about defying the troops. But they decide to go peacefully at first, so their outright defiance is not shown when the troops get there at first. In fact, the troops arrive in October 1769. Bostonians showed their feelings on their faces. It was like, we don't want you here. They didn't talk to them, no eye contact. They walked past the troops, but they were trying to keep things peaceful. They didn't want anybody hurt any more than actually the British did, to be honest with you. The other 12 colonies are aware of what's going on, and they begin to understand what Boston and Massachusetts have been saying all along, that the British government is willing to be tyrannical. They're willing to be a despot or a tyrant. They're willing to take away civil liberties, and they're willing to do it with an army, which means they're willing to do it with violence. So we have the Boston Massacre. On March 5, 1770, 60 angry Bostonians gathered outside the customs house. That's the place where they go to pay taxes, but it's where their offices are. That's like the IRS to us. So you've got the customs house with the tax collectors in there, and they show up and they're protesting the Townshend taxes. The military is called to get them to leave, but things get violent. If you've ever been in Massachusetts, you know it can be quite cold and snowy in March. Well, there was snow on the ground, and the crowd got mad when the military showed up, and by all accounts, the crowd started it. They threw rocks and snowballs with rocks and ice in them hurt, and they're dangerous, at the military. The British, without Captain Thomas Preston's permission, fired on the crowd. They killed 5 people. Crispus Attucks, a former slave who had gained his freedom, died. So sadly, one of the first free African Americans in the colonies dies during the Boston Massacre. Now, it's important to remember that Captain Thomas Preston did not give permission for his troops to fire on the crowd, but they did so anyway. Kind of like that scene in April Morning. So, trial and error. Here's the trial. They did take the British troops to trial. They arrested them and took them to trial. And Captain Preston and 4 of his men were cleared of the charges. They were not guilty of starting this. But 2 of the men were convicted of manslaughter, but they only suffered a branding of their thumbs as punishment. So they got hot coals or hot steel put against their fingers to brand them as having shot too soon, the trigger. And that was it. These men were represented by John Adams. Yes, that John Adams, okay? Remember, he's a British citizen too. And he successfully argues that the colonists started it, and they did indeed start it. But at the same time, in London, Parliament's like, this is insane that it's getting to the point of violence, so they repeal all of the Townshend taxes, but the one on tea. Yeah, they should have taken that tax back too. But I kind of like not being British, so I'm kind of glad they didn't, although it's kind of sad what happens in the future, because a lot of people die. And then, of course, whenever we have a tense political situation, we have propaganda. Remember that propaganda is neither good nor bad. It simply is how we convince somebody of our point of view. And Paul Revere was a propagandist. So what you see there is his print of the Boston Massacre. And if you look at it, it looks like everything is coming from the point of view of the British soldiers being very violent. Look at all that dirt. Look at the muskets pointed. Look at the very front. You can see Captain Thomas Preston with his sword raised. It's like he's giving the order, but that's not what happened. And then, of course, we have all of the colonials all shivering and bundled up together, when that was not the case. They were actively throwing things at them and doing things. And of course, you have the dead people and the dog. Even there's a little dog right there, gathered up around like they've been led to slaughter. And that's not what happened. But this depiction influences the other colonies. The other colonies see this depiction of the Boston Massacre. And by the way, it's not really a massacre when 5 people die, okay? But I mean, it's sad, but a massacre usually involves like hundreds of people. Well, this is not quite an accurate representation of what actually happened according to historians. However, it does influence the other colonies to realize that things are quite serious and things are getting out of hand, okay? So the outcome of the Boston Massacre is that Massachusetts is going to call its legislature back in session, and Parliament's going to let them, okay? So they're going to get back to business. And they actually start arguing back and forth about what they should do about this tea tax, because many colonists are so relieved and worried and scared that they're willing to go, you know what, we'll just pay the tea tax and we're not going to worry about everything going on. We don't want violence in our town. So they start not just our town, but our country, our area. And so they start buying British goods again, okay? But there were some very angry Bostonians who wanted the boycott on tea continued. So there's nothing to boycott in regard to the other items, but let's continue that boycott on tea. Even though the trial ended with most of those soldiers getting off, the colonists now realized that the government would use lethal force, violence against its own citizens in the colonies to keep them in line. And because of this, a party is going to come, a tea party. We'll see about that tomorrow. You know what to do.